Hi, it's Dana, and I'm here with your divination for the full moon in Sidereal Libra. The 2026 Sidereal Astrology Guide says, clearly seeing the consensus of sameness. Break down. If you can't hold it, let it hold you. Let it carry you. When you've done all that you know to do. I have an announcement. And the announcement is starting on the next episode of the Divination for Liberation podcast. That's going to be episode 24. I am going to be offering a new segment where I give you astrological advice based on your birth chart. I'm going to drop a link or email in the comments where you can send your question and your birth information. And guess what? If you don't know your birth time, don't you worry your little head because I know how to do it without it. Isn't that exciting? So, yeah, next episode of the podcast, we're adding a new segment where I'm going to be offering astrological advice based on your birth chart. When I drop that link for you to send in your request, there will be stipulations for how to frame your inquiry and how to send your information so that you'll have a better chance of getting chosen. And I will have an easier time giving you the answer that you need. I'm not going to hold you. This is my least favorite time of year. This is my least favorite sequence of astrology. This is my least favorite pattern of lunations. And this happens every few years, like every 8 years, maybe, where we get a full moon in Libra ruled by Venus in Taurus. And then right after that, we get a new moon in Taurus. And this year, because the astrology distribution system wanted to really mess with us, we get a second new moon in Taurus mid-June. So we're about to do the Venus thing. And for those of you who are students and lovers of Divination for Liberation Sidereal Astrology, you already know that Venus is the police. I feel like I need somebody in here to do a sound effects of the air horns right there. Right? You already know that Venus is the police. By police, I not only mean the cops who like to harass black and brown people. I also mean the police in your mind that shames you for not conforming to the beauty standards of whiteness and the class standards of capitalism, right? I'm talking about the police as in the way that grown adults are currently circulating a video of young Black students who are struggling to read, humiliating them, embarrassing them, as is routine for adults to do to children, right? But I'm talking about the police that doesn't have grace, but the police that rebukes and shames and says, you are a bad person because you did a bad thing. Shame is really about who you are, not what you did. So I decided that I want to start off this portion of the podcast talking about the two Venus ruled signs, one being Libra, where the full moon is, and one being Taurus, where Venus is ruler of the full moon. And it just so happens I'm recording this podcast on Wednesday, April 29th, and we're just getting news that Supreme Court has taken another stab at the Voting Rights Act of 1965, essentially making it impotent. And this is a really great example of how both Venus ruled signs, they're two sides of the same coin, but they're often competing with each other. Libra, the sign of composure, the way that we decide what do you have the socially and legally, rather, consensus to do. What are the consequences for not complying with the law? What is the law? Right? The law is often the way that we codify social norms and expectations. We come together allegedly, we, and we allegedly decide that this is what people are allowed to do. And this is what they are not allowed to do. And these are the consequences that we are going to collectively put on somebody if they don't follow the law. So the law ruled by Libra is the way that we codify and establish a set of rules for which there are clear consequences and remedies. Right? Then we have Taurus, and Taurus is a little bit more nebulous. Taurus is the social expectations, it's the social norms, it's things that maybe aren't explicitly said, but you get the gist of it because it's impacting the way that you're treated. For example, being dirty is not against the law, but it is a social norm that you should probably pay attention to the way that you smell while you're in public, right? Being poor technically is not against the law, but also it is, right? Poverty is not a really good example because poverty really is against the law, especially when all of the remedies and consequences that we have for the laws usually have to do with a fee that poor people can't pay. So the law is for poor people. Taurus speaks to social norms that are generally about identity, they are about race, they are about gender, they're about class. Taurus is about morality. The law is not moral, even though we like to say that people who break the law are immoral and that there are consequences for that immorality, usually social. But think of Taurus as morality and immorality that often has very little to do with the law, right? I mean, just look at CEOs and corporations. They're doing immoral things all the time. They are stealing resources. They are poisoning water. They are raising the cost of living. They are hoarding all of the wealth. They are depleting the global south of their natural resources without fair trade and compensation. All of those things are immoral, but they are a social norm. They are things that we have not established a collective census in the form of the law to create consequences for. And so today, we're getting news that the Supreme Court has gutted the Voting Rights Act once again by allowing a state to use its gerrymandered map that essentially disenfranchises Black people in Louisiana from voting. This is the law. This is the quote consensus that we have allegedly decide is something that you can do without consequences from the state. But this is where the balance to Venus really comes in. Part of the problem that we face in America is that we have allowed ourselves to believe that voting is the only power that we have as citizens, and that every change that we desire, everything that we are upset with, every injustice, the answer is to vote. The answer is to vote harder. The answer is to vote better, right? And that if you don't like the way that things are, you better vote. And if you don't vote, you don't get to be unhappy or complain about the way that things are because voting is the only power that you have in this country. This is what they tell us. And so when the people that we vote for do not fulfill their promises that they made during elections, when the people that we vote for are participating in creating legislation that is completely contradictory to our quality of life, our ability to afford to live, our ability to be safe. What is the remedy? Right? What is the remedy? And so this is a really important thing that's happening at this full moon because how many months? What is this? April, May, June, July, August, September. So in about 4 or 5 months, Venus is going to retrograde in Libra where this full moon is. And Libra, as the sign of consensus and law, this Venus retrograde is going to be occurring during the midterm elections here in the United States, where our state and congressional representatives that we send to Washington, we vote for them and we say, hey, this is who we want to represent us. These are the policies that we support as the constituents of these particular representatives that we have. But time and time again, we're seeing that the representatives we have are not interested in actually implementing the policies that we want. So I think that clearly seeing the consensus of sameness is at this full moon is really about something that I talked about. I posted a thread about it. I don't know if I talked about it in the last episode of the podcast, but it's this pattern where Taurus transits are often moments where the status quo is reinforced and re-entrenched. The status quo being white violence and domination, the status quo being capitalist hoarding and pillaging and destroying the environment, the status quo being a surveillance police state, the status quo being fascism, the status quo being femicide, the status quo being, male domination and violence against children and women and each other, quite frankly. Like the status quo is entrenched and reinforced during Taurus transits, which is why I started off this podcast episode talking about this being my least favorite time of year and my least favorite kind of sequence of transits that happens every so often, probably about every 8 years. So we get this moment where we get clear on the status quo and what it is. And generally, our reaction to this is to tell people, see, this is why you got to vote. This is why you got to vote harder. You didn't vote. And see, we should have voted for Kamala Harris. You think Kamala Harris was going to stop this? Like, the reason why Kamala Harris is not in office is because of this, is because of this gerrymandering. And we have seen so clearly that Democrats are not representing us. Democrats are our enemy. Democrats serve the capitalist class. Democrats want money that we don't have, and so they serve the interest of the people that can give it to them. Clearly seeing the consensus of sameness, I feel like it's like real surface right now, too. That the consensus of sameness is not about divergent political parties and divergent policy platforms, right? Now, don't get me wrong. There are some great bills that have just been introduced, I think, in the House that are a bunch of like New Deal adjacent bills about affordable child care, paid vacation, paid leave. There was one for federally manufactured generic pharmaceuticals that are meant to lower the cost of prescription drugs. There were a few other I can't remember right now. So there are people who are making an effort, but those are existing as a minority, an anomaly amongst the status quo of sameness. And this goes back to this video that I constantly post at moments like this, where I talk about basically that Democrats are controlled opposition and their function is not actually to execute the will of the people who voted for them. Their function is to quench our revolutionary spirit. It is to give us the satisfaction of representation in the form of people who look like us, who share our racial or ethnic identity, who share our gender identity. It is to quench this desire for representation in an identity way, but does not execute the policy choices that would actually be representative of our class interest. Democrats are our class enemy. Democrats are your class enemy. Your class says that you work for a wage that you do not get to determine. You do not get to determine the cost of your labor. The federal minimum wage has been the same for almost 20 years. You have voted for increases in the federal minimum wage because the representatives you voted for have promised to go to Washington and enact that legislation and pass it, right? Democrats are your class enemy. And so, what we're going to see between now and mid June, when we go through this full moon in Libra, ruled by Venus in Taurus, and then we'll have a new moon in Taurus, then we'll have a full moon in Scorpio, and then another new moon in Taurus. This little period is like the next sequence of astrology. Once we get past that, we'll be on to something else come mid June. But this window we're in right now, from basically mid April to mid June, look at the consensus of sameness. By sameness, and I'm going to get way more into this when we talk about the Scorpio full moon at the beginning of June. Who are you the same as? And by same, I mean who sees threats, who identifies danger to their survival the same way that you do, who shares an enemy with you. This is really what Taurus is about collectively. When we go back to 2020 and we began a new eclipse series then in Sidereal Taurus and Scorpio, in that spring, we had a Venus retrograde in Taurus. And for me, this was really reflective of two things. One was how we collectively had a very clear consensus on what the threat was, and the threat was COVID, and that allowed us to act in concert in a way that really materialized as socialist policies that we were always told was not possible. It is not possible to do eviction moratoriums. It is not possible to increase access to Medicaid. It is not possible to end child poverty. It is not possible to, um, you know, all of these things, send people money, right? But because we had a clear sense on what the threat was in a way that, like, you really couldn't deny because the death was immediate. The death was in numbers you couldn't ignore. And so part of the way that we're propagandized and tricked and bamboozled and manipulated is that we don't really see death as the threat that it actually is. We don't see that death is a consequence of the minimum wage not being raised for almost 20 years. We don't see death as the consequence of having your health care tied to your employment at a rate you can't afford to pay. We don't see death as the consequence of failing our children and creating a generation of illiteracy. We don't see death as the consequences of those things. And so, because we don't see death as the consequences of those things, we can't decide and come to a consensus about how to respond to them. And this is where we talk about the ruler of this full moon being Venus and Taurus being a fixed sign. Fixed signs are Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius. And they're about identity. They're about, how do I know what I know? And Taurus, I'm sorry, how do I know who I am? And Taurus is often trying to mimic and mirror the people around them so that they don't stand out as different and as a threat. So we tend to conform to the consensus of sameness rather than seeing the consensus of sameness as a threat that we actually need to change. So this is part of this point here, and part of this sequence of the next couple of months is that voting should really be quite low on the list of actions we can take to exercise our power to change. Capitalists are not going to concede their grip on your state representative. Capitalists are not going to concede their grip on the office of the president. Capitalists are not going to concede their control of your senator in Washington. They're not going to let it go. And your representative is not going to say no to the money. So now that we know that those two things are facts, what do? There's a tradition of anarchy that says we have to build, and let me be clear. Let me be real clear. There is a tradition of Black anarchy and Black anarchists that talk about the need to build parallel structures. And we need to build these parallel structures similar to what the Black Panther Party did in a way that renders the state obsolete and irrelevant. You're trying to beg people to save your life that literally are killing you, right? We have to organize. None of this is new. There's no reason for us to be on the internet saying, okay, but what do we do? Because there are people doing it. If you're on the internet saying, what should we do? It means that you're not in your neighborhood community in relationship with the people that are doing it. And no, I don't mean nonprofit organizations. No, I don't mean applying for grants. I'm talking about my homegirl Emerald in Chicago, who for several years, probably over a decade at this point, has had something called the Sandwich Ministry that literally stands out in the streets passing out food to hungry people. They don't have to give their personal information. They don't have to prove how much they make. They don't have to prove that they're poor. There's no means testings here. You hungry, here's a sandwich. And you can come back tomorrow and get another one. This is not complicated. This is not complicated. We have centuries of models of how we can organize ourselves into collectives and communities around our consensus of sameness. But we are still allowing white supremacy and capitalist and patriarchy to decide the things that we collectively gather ourselves around, the identities that are most important. We see the identities that are most important being, our gender, being our race, being our sexual identity. And there's a way that, yes, in order to combat the forces of oppression of this state, that we have to come together under some type of consensus and organize under those labels. And so this is not me saying that racism doesn't matter. And for sure, this is not me saying that homophobia, transphobia, misogynoir, and femicide doesn't matter. But the root is racial capitalism. So when we talk about a consensus of sameness and seeing it clearly, what I'm admonishing you to look at and to look for to see clearly is, are you rightly identifying what the threat to your life is? And if so, who are you in community with and building relationship with who also identifies the threat the same? But I think the real issue of where we're at right now is we are not rightly identifying the threat. We're still blaming trans people. We are still blaming immigrants. We are still blaming women for their own murder and the betrayal that they experience. We're still blaming children for the fact that they can't read. Like we got to get it together, man. Like, and we got to get it together fast. I've talked about how Taurus transits re-entrench the status quo. And these are dark times because it's really an opportunity for you to clearly see what the status quo is. We had a period of time in the 90s and the 2000s, really up until, you know, Obama's presidency, and the white people devolved into the feral, violent creatures that they tend to be when they see Black people doing anything other than being slaves, where increased acceptance of differing gender and sexual identities and policies that were increasingly supportive of, our self-determination politically and economically, right? We had a small window where democracy seemed to kind of be a thing that was a thing here, but that window is closed. So we can't move forward thinking that the consensus of the 90s and 2000s is still the consensus that's governing now. The Libra Taurus kind of dichotomy that we're at this full moon is really a dichotomy between ideals and reality. The law is the ideal. The law is who we ideally want to be and the values that we ideally hold. But realism, the social realities, which can be understood through the lens of imperialism and capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy, racism, adultism, right? The realism is that the ideals of who we want to be as a society, the ideals of our values as a society are in direct contradiction with the reality of who we are. And that's what we need to see in this moment. As always, right? This this brings us to very personal dichotomies and contradictions that we have to deal with. I want to share one more piece of news, current event stuff, and then I'm going to pull some cards. There's a clip of a white male comedian doing this bit where there's a trans person in the audience, and he asks this trans person what they do. And this trans person says that they work for a defense contractor. And the comedian goes on to basically, you know, behave so shocked and like he can't understand how a trans person is working for a defense contractor that bombs children. And I've seen this post on Blue Sky, I've seen this post on Threads, and the comments are pretty much the consensus is shaming this trans person for having this job. And I have an unpopular take and opinion on this. Because of the way this society is structured, and particularly capitalism and its grip and influence on this society, because voting really is not a source of power, we get stuck trying to make these other things the place we live out our conviction. Many of us see our jobs as the place that we would ideally like to live out our convictions. We want our job to show our politics and say what type of person you are. That's liberalism, though. And liberalism likes to say that I don't care if I don't have to see it. You can shame the trans person for working for a defense contractor that builds rockets because you can could directly tie that company and their actions to the death of children in Gaza. But the job that you have, you don't have to look at dead people. The chain and the distance between you and the dead children, your job is murdering. The corporation that you're working for is murdering. It's so long that you get to have some distance. And so those deaths aren't associated with your actions. Liberalism said, I don't have a problem with it as long as I don't have to know about it and as long as I don't have to look at it. You don't have to worry about robbing the global south and depleting the soil of the global south so that the people who actually live there, whose land it is, can grow no food. But that don't have nothing to do with you, right? So you can shame the trans person. Your job is not the place for your convictions. And when you understand that, you'll find the place that really is for your convictions. This is an example of not being able to imagine outside of capitalism. And what are the new consensuses we want to create outside of capitalism? Our imaginations are still in the bubble of capitalism, that we want to signal virtue through the corporation we sell our labor to. Huh. Well, at least the corporation I sell my labor to doesn't bomb children in Gaza. It only steals the land of indigenous people in the Amazon. At least my job isn't making bombs for war. My job is just charging poor people in America too much for groceries they can't afford. Yeah, you ringing it up at the register. Now what? Yeah, you work for a corporation who's gouging their prices so that the people in your neighborhood can't afford to eat. We have to imagine outside these systems. And we have to be mindful that signaling virtue is not going to save you. It's going to make you feel liked. It's going to make you feel like you belong. It's going to make you feel good about yourself. It's going to make you feel better than a person who hasn't lucked up in the capitalist lottery, but it's not going to get you free. Let's pull some cards. What is the goal? Like, do you want them to quit their job? Do you want the internet to bully them? Like, what is it that you want? What's going to please you? We can't make individuals the target, especially individual workers. If you want to make somebody the target, target the company, target the contractor. If we're going to start shaming people for their jobs, then everybody get in line. The reality that we want to call forth is one where we don't have to choose between a job that bombs children and a job that disenfranchises, children from their ability to learn how to read. Like it's the same, y'all. It's the same, lesser evil in harm reduction. The reduction of harm is that you don't have to look at it. That's what gets reduced. You don't have to look at it. You don't have to see the harm. That's the only harm that gets reduced. It gets to be off your TV screen in an area of the world that you don't have to look at with people who you don't have to see their humanity. All right. I'm back with my tarot cards. I'm a little fired up. I don't know if y'all can tell. I'm a little fired up. But we're going to see what these cards have to say for this full moon in Sidereal Libra, clearly seeing the consensus of sameness. We're starting off with the Four of Pentacles. And this is a card of protection. What I'm getting from this card in this moment is that we often leave things unprotected because we don't recognize the value of it. And value is one of those things that is instilled in us because other people reward us for it. The things that we're rewarded for are things that we can easily see the value of, things that we are shamed for, things that we are bullied for, things about us that are ignored are really hard to see the value of. And when we don't see the value of something, we don't protect it. We leave it vulnerable and we leave it exposed. So maybe with the Four of Pentacles, this card is saying, what is it that we need to see the value of because it is deserving of our protection? What is it that maybe it's an aspect of yourself. Maybe it's something that you've created. Maybe it's a relationship. Whatever it is, what is it that you need to see the value of because you've left it exposed and you need to protect it? You need to protect yourself. I always like to offer a little nuance because the other side of this is that the Four of Pentacles can be too closed off. It can be too protective. It can feel an excessive sense of vulnerability that closes them off, not only from the danger, but also from the good. So we'll see which way this goes when we look at the rest of these cards. We've got the Sun and we've got the Ten of Swords. If you were here on episode 22 of the Divination for Liberation podcast, you know that the Ten of Swords was a card that we pulled then. These are the things that I can't make up. I can't force that to happen, which is why one of my values says that spirit always confirms. Whatever I say here, this is not the law. I'm not the only one that has access to spirit. I'm not the only one that divines. I'm not the only one with an intuition. When I say spirit always confirms, if you hear it here, you'll hear it somewhere else too. Maybe not in the same way, but it'll resonate with something in you as a form of confirmation, or you'll hear it from somewhere else. Sun and Ten of Swords. So, what did we say about the Ten of Swords last time? We talked about how the Ten of Swords can be representative of times where we're overthinking, where we have reached the limits of the tool of our intellect. We've reached the limits of the tool of conversation. We've reached the limits of thinking about something as a means to solving the problem. I think in some ways, um, the Ten of Swords is one of those, uh, don't talk about it, be about it, right? That I think there is a level of avoidance and maybe even dissociation associated with over intellectualizing and repeatedly thinking about something and needing to keep looking up and researching and asking questions and getting other people's opinion. There's a way I think that is a sign of being divorced from one's own body, divorced from one's own desire, divorced from one's survival instinct. In the midst of all of this, we still have Mars in Pisces. We still have Saturn in Pisces at this full moon. And the sun and Mercury are in Aries. So Mars in Pisces is still pulling some heavy weight. And so it's still saying connect the dots or else, right? Your body is a useful and meaningful tool. While everybody's out there debating about who's a human and who gets to vote and who gets represented and who has a right to do what with their power, Mars in Pisces and Saturn in Pisces are still saying there's an element you're not seeing here. There's a facet of this that you can't read about, you can't research. AI is no help for you here. Having conversations and thinking about it over and over and over is not going to help you here. There's an element of silence in both the Ten of Swords and the Four of Pentacles. That's really about when you silence the external, what do you fear? I'm sorry, what do you feel? What do you hear from your own body? What are the patterns that emerge? I also think the Ten of Swords is related to Jupiter in Gemini in that the threshold for self trust and certainty for Jupiter in Gemini is so high you can never meet it. There's never enough information. There's never enough validation. There's never enough conversation. There's never enough degrees or books or Google searches or Chat GPT inquiries. There's never enough for you to be like, okay, I think I know for real now. Right. So I think with the Ten of Swords and the Four of Pentacles, there really is this drawing in on oneself as a means to really discerning your way forward at this moment. We've got the sun. The sun is one of the most straightforward cards in the tarot to me, in that it's generally kind of one dimensional in its meaning. And it's that what you're looking at is exactly what it looks like. There's nothing hidden here, there's no hidden agenda. What you see is what you get. Where in your life can solitude and silence support you in seeing the consensus of sameness? Where and I feel like there's something here about reclaiming and like pulling back your projections onto things that keeps you from seeing them as they are. When I talk about social realism as the meaning of Taurus, where Venus is at this full moon, the ruler of the full moon, social realism is about a baseline of accepting the social reality. The social reality is fascist. The social reality rewards men's lack of empathy. The social reality doesn't see anything wrong with Black women being murdered by their partners. The social reality, RFK Jr. made it clear in front of Congress. The Black maternal health crisis, the crisis of pregnant Black women dying in childbirth or due to childbirth or in pregnancy, it's not an issue to him. It doesn't matter. Accepting the social reality says you see things exactly as they are, not how you want them to be, not how you imagine things to be. There's something about the way that we project our own values onto figures we identify with. We project our values onto people who share our racial identity. We think just because Kamala Harris is a Black woman with a half wig and a silk press and a skiwi, that somehow that alone makes her have the same values as us. Another way to think about it is we assume that people we share identities with see the threat of death as coming from the same source as we do. This is why representation is never going to be what you think it is. Because just because someone looks like you or shares the pronouns or racial identity that you do, that doesn't mean they have the sobriety to recognize where the threat of death is coming from. You know what I'm talking about. Those of you who date men and you get on social media and you see a Black man and he's the only Black man in the picture and everybody else is white, my mans, you're in danger. You don't see that? You don't feel that? You're not aware of that? Same thing could be said to Kamala Harris. You up there with that white man as your husband, surrounded by a white man as your boss, surrounded by white men as your colleagues. My girl, you are in danger. The sun says it's exactly what it looks like. What is exactly what it looks like in your life right now? And let me be clear when I say that. I mean, what is the social reality that you don't like, that you would prefer to not be true? But it's exactly what it looks like. What role is your intuition, your inner knowing, your pattern recognition playing in your ability to see things as they are? This is a get real moment, whether that's personally in your life, in your relationships, because that's the only place from which we can actually change anything. I think that the theme that's emerging at this full moon and the theme that's emerging in these cards is something that's going to carry us for the next couple of months. So when you come back for episode 24 and 25 and 26 of the Divination for Liberation podcast, God willing, we're still going to be talking about this. I'm still going to be asking you, do you know where the threat of death is really coming from? Are you able to connect the day-to-day oppression that you experience, not being able to pay your bills or worrying about where the money for your bills is going to come from? That's death. It may not come tomorrow, but that cortisol is building up in your body and it's shutting down your digestion, giving you acid reflux. It's got your bowels locked up. It's taking your appetite. You're not getting REM sleep. You're craving sugar and functioning off caffeine. You're chain smoking. You're hitting the vape. The death may not be tomorrow, but it's coming. And what community is being built around a shared, real recognition of where the threat is coming from. That means, does the Democratic Party and the people you perceive to be your representative or prospective representative, do they see the threat of death the same as you do? Y'all gonna jump scare at the same thing? Do they jump scare at their electric bill? Is that a jump scare to them? Who are you identifying with? You want people to perform values that are the same as you when the real stakes is we need people to save our lives. And it starts with you. This has been lovely. Thank you for tuning in to the Divination for Liberation podcast. I am your host, Dana Lynn Knuckles, also known as the People's Oracle. Everybody's favorite part of the podcast, which is my COVID update. You know, I drop a link in the description of this podcast episode every couple weeks, which is to wastewater data that is calculating how much COVID is transmitting at any given time based on how much COVID is found in wastewater. Been talking about this being the lull, and we are at a 5-year lull. The only time over since the beginning of the pandemic that was lower in terms of COVID transmission as to where we are was May of 2021. That's when we still had mask mandates. That's when we've had the vaccine. And then we know Delta came after that. The astrology is not going to repeat. The astrology of the Delta wave that we saw in 2021, I predicted that. It's on Twitter. It's not going to repeat. As far as I'm concerned, if there was going to be a COVID wave, it would literally be right now. It would literally be right now. So there are still a couple of states that have sketchy wastewater data in terms of, is it high? Is it very high? I don't know. But the map is mostly low or very low. Does that mean that COVID is gone? No. Does that mean that people are not getting COVID? No. You need to make sure that you are, if possible, checking wastewater in your state and in your county to be sure. If there is going to be a surge of COVID this year, it will be during the winter. And part of what's happening is that SARS coronavirus 2, which is the virus that causes COVID, has been rapidly mutating for the past 6 years, since the beginning. And it's kind of hit a wall where it's kind of run out of mutations. And so, because of that, we're not seeing surges of COVID fueled by mutated variants that can get past the immunity of previous infections. All of that to say, when updated vaccines come out over the next couple of months, get yours, right? Don't let your guard down. I don't think that COVID is gone forever. I want to make that really, really clear. I don't think that COVID is gone forever. I think that we will be in really low transmission for the foreseeable future, save maybe, the end of the year around the holiday. But into 2027 and 2028, 2029, 2030, that whole might come back with vengefulness, okay? but maybe we'll have figured it out by then. I don't know. I don't know. In the meantime, in between time, please take care of yourself. Don't believe the propaganda and stop embarrassing and humiliating children on the internet. I'll see you in a couple weeks. Bye.